Archaeological strata and recovered artifacts provide the first firm points of contact for any attempt to reconstruct the conflicts that reshaped Old Earth. Stratified layers of vitrified soil, collapsed orbital elevator pylons, and caches of battlefield-grade power cells have been dated and correlated across multiple dig sites. Metallurgical analysis of recovered alloy fragments shows manufacturing techniques inconsistent with surviving city-state workshops, while paleobotanical surveys record abrupt shifts in local ecology consistent with extended high-intensity combat. Eyewitness testimony survives only in fragments, battered municipal annals, priestly chronicles preserved in subterranean vaults, and a handful of later transcriptions by agents of the sigillite. These records are incomplete and often contradictory, but when read alongside the material record they converge on a single conclusion. During the late Age of Strife, a sustained program of conquest and political consolidation was executed on a planetary scale, and the evidence for that program is the corpus scholars designate as the Unification Wars. The Unification Wars began against a backdrop of millennia of dislocation. By millennia 29, Terra had long been fractured into countless polities, ranging from industrial hive cities and techno-arcologies to warlord domains that combined ritualized violence with scavenged high technology. Weather and warp phenomena had isolated many regions, trade networks were sporadic, and local knowledge often degenerated into ritualized crafts. Into this fractured landscape emerged an actor who would be identified by later records as the Emperor of Mankind. His stated objective, as preserved in both recovered proclamations and the later official histories, was to end internecine slaughter and reforge disparate human communities into a single polity capable of projecting power beyond the planet. That motivation was not merely political, it was framed as a practical prerequisite for the later campaign the Emperor intended to prosecute beyond Terra's skies. The narrative constructed from archaeological finds, fragmentary eyewitness material, and contemporary reconstructions treats the unification effort as an intentional, sustained campaign to create a unified human polity from the ruins of the Age of Strife. Operationally, the Emperor's force structure combined genetically engineered infantry, elite custodial detachments, and nascent formations that would later be identified as legions of Space Marines. The earliest and most conspicuous instrument of his ground campaigns were the so-called Thunder Warriors, human beings subjected to extensive and rapid augmentation, designed to produce overwhelming battlefield effects. Contemporary technical fragments and controlled interrogations of surviving documents indicate that these soldiers were created in clandestine laboratories, fielded in comparatively small but highly effective cohorts, and used in concentrated offensives against fortified technocratic enclaves. Surviving doctrine fragments attribute to the Emperor deliberate sequencing. Deploy engineered shock troops to break or neutralize techno-barbarian command structures, then consolidate control using provisional military and civic institutions that could govern captured territories. Parallel witness fragments and recovered command logs reference the employment of the custodian guard as both ceremonial protectors and decisive field units during key operations. The technical and tactical profile assembled from these sources presents a force optimized for rapid, decisive action against fractured, heavily fortified polities. The human geography of the conflict was both varied and dense. Some regions were compact industrial zones with layered urban strata and high population densities. Others were sparsely populated highlands or icebound enclaves. Many of the named polities that figure in later chronicles, kingdoms and confederacies memorialized by surviving civic records, exhibited distinct cultural practices and military specializations. Certain northern confederacies practiced forms of sacrificial warfare and genetic tampering that contemporary imperial records later condemned. Other regions retained functioning heavy industry, and defensive prototypes descended from the dark age of technology. The material evidence and corroborating chronicles show that entire populations were at times absorbed into the post-conflict economy as labor elements, conscript pools, or custodial labor for reconstituted infrastructure. Population figures for Terra in this period are not consistently recorded. Modern reconstructions therefore rely on a synthesis of demographic inference and site-specific excavation. Those reconstructions place urban concentrations in the billions in some basins, while acknowledging wide variation and persistent uncertainty in exact totals. The unevenness of the human landscape both incentivized and complicated the campaign to unify the planet. Physically, the combatants of the unification period varied according to class and role. Ordinary citizens, where not subject to ritualized modification, were anatomically comparable to present-day human baselines. Archaeological osteology yields nothing to suggest wholesale physiological divergence of the general population. Men and women of urban classes typically carried the metabolic signatures of industrial diets and environmental pollutants, and their skeletal remains often show evidence of repetitive strain associated with specialized trades. By contrast, the engineered soldiers exhibit pathological markers consistent with aggressive augmentative procedures, enhanced bone density, surgically altered musculature attachment points, and prosthetic interfaces designed to anchor early powered armor prototypes. These anatomical markers, together with recovered armor fragments and contemporary eyewitness fragments, support a distinction in physical profile between unaugmented civilians and the genetically and surgically modified warriors who dominated battlefield narratives. Precise anthropometric averages for height and mass are not preserved in canonical primary sources. Modern scholarship therefore uses current human population baselines for reconstruction, while noting the margin of uncertainty introduced by augmentation technologies. Recruitment and force generation followed multiple channels. In some regions, traditional levée systems persisted, with city magistrates or tribal chiefs supplying conscripts drawn from agrarian and industrial populations. These forces were primarily tasked with local defense, garrison duty, and labor support for siege operations. In parallel, the Emperor's program relied on technological and genetic pipelines. Adult recruits were selected or abducted for augmentation under clandestine protocols, resulting in cohorts of engineered warriors intended for high-intensity operations. Later administrative records suggest the existence of recruitment quotas, concealment procedures to shield the augmentations from public view, and the use of allied technocratic clans to supply critical components and field support. The Emperor's forces also cultivated political alliances with certain city-states and industrial houses, integrating their skills in exchange for guarantees of protection and limited autonomy under the emergent planetary authority. These alliances, preserved in diplomatic fragments, helped to reduce the need for total systemic destruction in regions where governance could be co-opted. Civilian life under the shadow of the unification campaigns was heterogeneous. Where industrial capacity survived, production was redirected toward the provisioning of war machines, fortifications, and the logistical requirements of sustained campaigns. Urban populations experienced the requisitioning of goods and workforce mobilization. Archaeological strata show abrupt shifts in material culture linked to centralized provisioning and rationing. In areas conquered by martial elites and techno-barbarian lords, ritual and martial identities often persisted alongside forced incorporation into wartime economies. The Emperor's consolidation strategy combined punitive measures, executions of prominent warlords, the dismantling of hostile military infrastructure, and incentives, promises of reconstruction, the extension of protective treaties, and the offer of integration into a planetary polity with broader security guarantees. The combination of coercion and compensation evident in surviving records explains the mixture of fervent collaboration, strategic accommodation, and determined resistance recorded across the planet. Contemporary sources and later reconstructions identify a number of characteristic military and civic behaviours. Siegecraft in this period relied on both chemical and mechanical means. Recovered ordnance fragments and destroyed defensive systems indicate frequent use of seismic charges and directed energy systems salvaged from pre-collapse inventories. Field engagements could escalate into protracted continent-scale operations that left long-lasting environmental scars. The available evidence also documents episodes of summary violence, and politically motivated purges carried out during or immediately after campaigns, measures intended to prevent the re-emergence of rival power bases. Where reconciliation was attempted, official proclamations often accompanied the deployment of peacekeeping contingents and administrative overseers tasked with integrating local governance into a planetary framework. These administrative and military patterns are visible both in material remains and in surviving annalistic fragments. The record for specific theatres and key confrontations is uneven but instructive. Several named polities recur in surviving sources. Some capitulated after demonstration engagements and negotiated settlements, while others were ground down in sustained attritional warfare. Certain violent episodes are explicitly recounted in the fragments: campaigns that ended in mass executions, the use of forbidden technology by desperate polities, and examples of local elites attempting to reassert control through covert alliances. The character of these engagements varied from rapid shock operations to long sieges that lasted for years. It is from this patchwork of local narratives, cross-referenced with recovered ordnance, tactical fragments, and later administrative codices, that a coherent historical narrative for the planet-wide campaign can be assembled. One of the most discussed and controversial elements of the period is the transition from the initial cadre of engineered shock troops to the later, more systematized Legiones Astartes, and the institutional structures that would become the core of planetary defense. Contemporary fragments allude to a decisive reorganization near the close of the campaign, mass withdrawals of certain augmented units from active deployment, a reconstitution of elite protective formations, and the political marginalization of specific wartime leaders. The event most prominently cited in later chronicles is a climactic engagement memorialized under a name derived from a prominent geographic landmark. This engagement and its immediate aftermath have been treated in different ways by competing sources. Official chronicles emphasize valor and sacrificial closure, while other reconstructions point to internal purges and strategic eliminations, carried out to make way for a more stable and generationally sustainable military architecture. The divergence between official commemorative narratives and forensic reconstructions remains one of the core interpretive tensions in the study of the period. The consequences of the unification program were both immediate and long-term. Conquest consolidated political authority over most of the planet, created administrative frameworks for planetary governance, and initiated arrangements with off-planet technocratic centers that would prove crucial for later projects. The consolidation also produced a period of enforced cultural realignment, during which state orthodoxy, articulated in administrative documents recovered from later archives, sought to suppress certain cultic practices and prescribe technological rites deemed destabilizing. At the same time, the campaigns left deep structural and demographic consequences, disrupted production networks, altered urban hierarchies, and the displacement of entire populations. The combination of martial success and administrative centralization set the conditions for subsequent expansionary efforts beyond Terra. This section has outlined the material premises and immediate social consequences of the planetary campaigns, the weaponry and human resources that underwrote them, and the administrative impulses that guided consolidation. The subsequent sections will examine in greater technical detail the technologies, armaments, formations, and social institutions that emerged from the conflict, and then proceed to the catalogue of principal engagements, their conduct, and their aftermath as reconstructed from surviving evidence. The evidence assembled for the Unification project indicates a sustained, systematic effort that concluded with a set of political arrangements and military transformations which, together, define the later trajectory of human expansion from Terra. The Unification Wars. Archaeological and textual sources converge on the fact that the Unification Wars were not only a human and political process, but also a technological reawakening. After millennia of regression during the Age of Strife, much of Old Earth's technical inheritance was fragmented, ritualized, or hoarded by local warlords who treated devices as sacred relics. The consolidation of Terra brought about a gradual stabilization of these technologies, and the Emperor's campaigns employed a spectrum of weapons and machines that had their origin in the dark age of technology, even if adapted to more primitive means. The surviving fragments, ranging from weapon housings excavated beneath ruined fortresses to administrative inventories issued in the immediate aftermath, offer a picture of technological variety, improvisation, and controlled restandardization under the emerging Terran Imperium. Personal armament among the Emperor's engineered warriors displayed characteristics distinct from the weaponry of the techno-barbarian states. Excavated fragments of early power armor, sometimes classified by scholars as proto-MK armor, show an emphasis on dense ceramite plating and reinforced servo motors to compensate for the mass of heavy weaponry. The Thunder Warriors, who were deployed as shock troops, are recorded as carrying crude but devastating power weapons, chain blades, and energy-projecting firearms that could melt through ferrocrete redoubts. Surviving descriptions of these battles preserved in later chronicles repeatedly emphasize the lethality of their armament and its psychological impact on less technologically endowed opponents. Even unaugmented soldiers fighting under the Emperor's banner benefited from the proliferation of las projectors, solid slug weapons with enhanced propellant systems, and rudimentary support from mechanized platforms. In contrast, the weaponry of the hostile city-states and tribal confederations often combined archaic forms with scavenged technology. It was not unusual to find populations wielding swords, spears, and crude ballistic rifles alongside salvaged plasma casters or reactivated war automata. The danger of such combinations lay in their unpredictability. A force seemingly limited to blades and shields might possess a handful of ancient energy projectors capable of halting an armoured advance. The Emperor's armies developed countermeasures, including the use of heavily shielded vanguard units and early pattern Terminator armour to absorb initial volleys of advanced fire before engaging in decisive close assault. Reports compiled by later Mechanicum archivists remark on the wide spectrum of energy emissions recorded on ancient Terran battlefields, from simple chemical propellants to unstable plasma discharges, evidence of a technological landscape fragmented and volatile. The role of tools and battlefield equipment in this period also deserves mention. Siegecraft required both ancient and reconfigured devices, seismic charges designed to undermine fortress foundations, energy cutters for breaching bulkheads, and mining servitors adapted for war. Surviving fragments of voxcasters suggest that communication was increasingly standardized under the Emperor's banner, with signal protocols introduced to replace the cacophony of tribal drums and ritual horns that many techno-barbarian cultures used to coordinate their forces. Portable power generators, recovered from ruined encampments, provided the energy needed to operate heavy weaponry and life support systems. These were often modified civilian devices, reconfigured for field use by artificers and bonded technicians operating under the Emperor's directive. Vehicles during the Unification Wars were limited by what could be salvaged or reconstructed, but the Emperor's forces nonetheless fielded a range of mechanized platforms. Early patterns of rhino transports appear in accounts from this era, though their reliability was lower than the refined designs that would emerge later. Some fragments suggest that land raiders, or their conceptual ancestors, were already in operation, massive, heavily armoured carriers capable of delivering troops directly into fortified positions. Jet bikes and grav vehicles were also documented in limited numbers, often serving as reconnaissance and strike elements. By contrast, the techno-barbarian states frequently relied on crude tanks, scavenged walkers, and jury-rigged transports powered by whatever fuel could be extracted. The disparity lay not only in quality but in logistics. While the Emperor's armies worked to stabilize supply and ensure redundancy, rival forces often deployed their vehicles as one-time assets, to be expended in battle without expectation of replacement. The broader technological landscape reveals a duality between rediscovery and suppression. Certain technologies, such as advanced artificial intelligence, were already viewed with suspicion and hostility. Surviving records suggest that the Emperor acted decisively to root out self-replicating machines and autonomous war engines left over from the Dark Age. Instead, the emphasis was on technologies that could be controlled, maintained by human operators, and subordinated to strategic command. Energy weapons, gene-forging techniques, and heavy armor were preserved and standardized, while more volatile systems were systematically destroyed or hidden. This policy foreshadowed the long-standing Imperium-wide prohibition on abominable intelligences, a prescription grounded not only in ideology but in pragmatic lessons learned during unification. Alongside the tools of war, the Unification Wars fostered the beginnings of a social structure that would later define imperial governance. At its apex stood the Emperor himself, presented not as a distant monarch but as the direct commander of campaigns. His presence on the battlefield, attested by multiple chronicles, reinforced both his personal authority and the legitimacy of the entire enterprise. Below him, the Custodian Guard served as both protectors and exemplars, embodying the ideal of absolute loyalty and martial supremacy. The Thunder Warriors operated as instruments of overwhelming violence, a temporary tool by design, while unaugmented humans filled the ranks of support troops, logistics personnel, and provisional garrisons. This hierarchy was not merely military but ideological, teaching the early population of unified Terra that authority flowed from the Emperor and his chosen instruments downward. The leadership of conquered regions was systematically dismantled or reabsorbed. Tribal chieftains, warlords, and technocratic rulers who resisted were eliminated. Those who chose accommodation could sometimes retain limited influence as regional administrators, but only under close supervision. Surviving proclamations emphasized the replacement of arbitrary hereditary rule with appointments tied to loyalty and service. Councils of overseers were established in major cities, often composed of figures drawn from local elites who had demonstrated willingness to serve. This structure stabilized governance and provided continuity in administration, but it was always subordinate to central command. Values propagated during this era reflected both necessity and vision. Unity was presented as the supreme virtue, a counterpoint to the fragmentation of the Age of Strife. Loyalty to the Emperor was depicted as the guarantor of survival, while innovation was tolerated only insofar as it could be reconciled with central oversight. Militarism permeated daily life. Service, whether in combat or in provisioning roles, was treated as both duty and expectation. At the same time, the campaign cultivated an ethos of order, the suppression of chaotic cults, the prescription of practices deemed destabilizing, and the elevation of technical expertise under the Emperor's direction. These values, unity, loyalty, militarism, and controlled technical practice, would endure, hardening into the imperial creed in later millennia. From the available sources, it is clear that the Unification Wars cannot be reduced to simple conquest. They were also a process of technological curation and social engineering. The weapons, vehicles, and tools fielded in these conflicts were not merely implements of war but instruments in shaping the new human order. The social structure that emerged, hierarchical, centralized, and suffused with martial values, was both a reflection of the campaign's necessities and a deliberate construction designed to carry humanity beyond the borders of old Earth. The Emperor's victories were not only on battlefields but also in the creation of an enduring framework of power, authority, and controlled technological inheritance. The Unification Wars were not fought against an anonymous tide of fragmented peoples, but against identifiable powers, warlords, and factions that had, for centuries, entrenched themselves in the ruins of Terra. Their names survive in fragmentary chronicles, later imperial proclamations, and oral traditions recorded by early administratum archivists. Each power represented not just a military obstacle, but also a distinct social and cultural model, and in dismantling them, the Emperor of Mankind was not simply removing rivals, but systematically eradicating alternative visions of human organization. Among the most formidable opponents were the Panpacific tribes, sprawling warrior confederations that controlled large swathes of the Pacific Basin. Archaeological surveys of the region show layers of scorched urban material, fused sands from atomic detonations, and concentrations of battlefield debris that speak to prolonged campaigns. Contemporary accounts describe their warlords as ferocious rulers who combined martial tradition with the exploitation of salvaged technology. Some chronicles speak of ritualized cannibalism and gladiatorial culture, practices intended to enforce cohesion and terror among subject populations. Militarily, they fielded dense phalanxes of infantry supported by salvaged heavy weapons, and they were known for deploying biological and chemical agents with little regard for civilian casualties. Defeating the Panpacific tribes required the concentrated application of Thunder Warrior cohorts and sustained sieges that left lasting scars on the region. Another prominent opponent was the Indonesic Bloc, a technocratic federation based in the Indonesian archipelago. Unlike the Pan-Pacific tribes, they were less reliant on brute force and more defined by their control of advanced technologies, including gene forging, cybernetic manipulation, and early forms of mass production for war machines. Excavated remains of submerged factories and archives describe assembly line manufacture of war automata, crude analogues to later imperial servitors. The Bloc's leadership viewed itself as the inheritor of the dark age of technology and resisted the Emperor's unification with both technological pride and militarized fanaticism. Their eventual defeat, which required coordinated landings, naval operations, and the destruction of multiple fortified island complexes, is remembered as one of the most technologically intense engagements of the wars. Surviving material suggests that the Emperor personally oversaw critical phases of the campaign, ensuring the capture rather than destruction of certain manufacturing facilities to feed into the growing imperial war machine. In the western regions of Terra, the Nordafrik conclaves presented a different challenge. Situated across territories that had preserved vestiges of high industry, these conclaves controlled access to ancient mines, power plants, and machine repositories. Their rulers, sometimes styled as techno-barbarian kings, cultivated an image of divine authority rooted in technological relics. Excavated reliquaries suggest they possessed ancient energy weapons, vehicles of considerable antiquity, and entire archives of pre-imperial scientific texts. Yet their power rested on a fragile hierarchy of competing clans and sub-kings. The Emperor's strategy in this theatre exploited that fragility, forging temporary alliances with disaffected factions and employing shock offensives to dismantle central strongholds. The eventual collapse of the Nordafrik conclaves added a significant industrial base to the emergent Imperium. The American hegemony, located in the ruins of North America, was perhaps the most ideologically rigid of the foes encountered. Its leadership was militaristic to the extreme, blending rigid discipline with a culture of authoritarian surveillance. The hegemony had preserved elements of pre-strife governance and militarization, creating a society that viewed obedience and hierarchy as paramount virtues. Their armies were drilled, uniformed, and heavily armed compared to most contemporaries, and their propaganda, fragments of which survive in ruined archives, presented them as the legitimate heirs of ancient human states. Defeating the American hegemony required not only martial might, but also careful psychological warfare, undermining their sense of inevitability and breaking the bonds of fear that held their populations loyal. When the Emperor's forces finally overran their citadels, the collapse of their rigid structure was total and their system of governance was eradicated. Other notable powers included the Albia tribes of northwestern Europe, whose stubborn resistance and industrial capacity made them both dangerous opponents and eventually valuable allies. The Albia are recorded as fierce fighters who wielded advanced heavy armor and employed disciplined infantry tactics. Their conflict with the Emperor was particularly bloody, involving repeated assaults and counter-assaults. However, unlike other factions, the Albia were not exterminated, but instead incorporated into the imperial structure. Their martial traditions and technologies, particularly in metallurgy and wargear production, were integrated into the growing Imperium. The warlord Caligan of Ursh stands out as one of the most infamous figures of the Unification era. His domain stretched across vast territories in Central Asia, and he ruled through a combination of terror, military might, and a semi-religious cult of personality. Caligan fielded immense armies equipped with salvaged and manufactured weapons, including archaic artillery and energy weapons. He is most notorious for commanding entire corps of cybernetically modified soldiers, creations that blurred the line between man and machine. Surviving chronicles describe his regime as brutal, marked by massacres, ritual executions, and the imposition of a strict hierarchical order. His eventual confrontation with the Emperor is remembered as one of the defining battles of the Unification Wars, a clash that pitted the largest armies of the age against one another. Callaghan's death marked the symbolic end of the techno-barbarian era and cemented the Emperor's supremacy over Terra. The survival of names such as the Pan-Pacific warlords, the Indonesic technocrats, the Nordafrik kings, the American generals, the Albia tribes, and Callaghan of Ursh reflects the diversity of opposition to unification. Each represented a distinct cultural and technological pathway, a different model of how humanity might organize itself in the aftermath of the Age of Strife. By defeating them, the Emperor not only conquered, but also selected which aspects of humanity's inheritance would endure. The brutality of the campaigns, the destruction of whole societies, and the selective preservation of certain traditions were not incidental. They were the deliberate shaping of a planetary civilization. At the conclusion of the Unification Wars, the legacy of these defeated factions remained only in fragments, incorporated technologies, assimilated populations, or cautionary tales preserved in imperial propaganda. The Emperor's vision prevailed, but the shadows of his fallen adversaries lingered in the collective memory of Terra, reminders of the cost of unification and the diversity of paths that had once seemed possible for humanity. The process of conquest and assimilation not only eliminated rival powers but also crystallized the values, hierarchy and military culture that would define the Imperium for millennia. The institutions of the Imperium that later came to dominate human governance and technology devoted considerable energy to reconstructing the history of the Unification Wars. Among them, the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus offered the most enduring commentaries. Their interest was not in glorification or myth, but in the dissection of systems, structures, and processes that underpinned the Emperor's campaigns. To the bureaucrats of the Administratum, the wars were studied as a demonstration of administrative order imposed upon chaos. To the Mechanicus, they represented the first coherent return to technological discipline in an age of ruin. Both sought to explain how Terra, fractured for millennia, could have been subdued at all. The Administratum approached the Unification as the earliest case study in planetary-scale governance. Before the Emperor's rise, warlords clung to territories with crude methods of coercion, extracting tribute without continuity, and ruling by fear rather than administration. Their dominions were fragile because they lacked permanence, their regimes dissolving as soon as resources ran dry or rival powers encroached. The Administratum scholars later categorized these structures as unsustainable proto-states, incapable of supporting prolonged campaigns or population growth. By contrast, the Emperor's consolidation was recognized as the first imposition of systemic management across Terra since the collapse of the Dark Age. The campaigns demonstrated that war alone could not secure dominion. Administration was the mechanism by which conquest could be converted into enduring rule. The records indicate that the Emperor's forces established supply depots that followed in the wake of advancing armies, ensuring food, ammunition, and equipment were never exhausted. Agricultural regions seized from defeated factions were not razed, but reorganized into productive zones, their yields redirected to sustain both the war effort and the populations brought under imperial control. The Administratum noted that where other warlords exhausted their lands, the Emperor cultivated them into lasting resources. This policy of preservation and integration was marked as the defining difference between ephemeral conquest and permanent unity. Even rudimentary census-taking was reported in captured territories, allowing the armies to account for available labour, conscription pools, and taxable productivity. Such practices would later evolve into the census systems of the Imperium itself, and archivists traced their origins directly to this era. The Mechanicus, for its part, assessed the same events from a technical standpoint. They did not dwell on questions of population management, but on the means by which the Emperor's forces sustained advanced weaponry, armour and vehicles on a scale unseen since the onset of Old Night. Warlords had access to relics of the dark age of technology, but employed them wastefully, without standardized ammunition or maintenance. The Emperor's armies, by contrast, operated with striking uniformity. Power armor was issued to elite cadres in standardized marks. Bolt guns appeared in sufficient numbers to suggest mass production rather than scavenging, and vehicles displayed design consistency rather than the ad hoc construction typical of the age. The Mechanicus concluded that the Emperor had access to stable production chains and the expertise required to maintain them, a feat that would have been considered impossible in the fragmented technological environment of Terra at the time. Evidence suggests that transportation and logistics were key to these achievements. Many regions of Terra had become isolated by wastelands, irradiated zones, or ruined infrastructure. Most warlords rarely projected force beyond their immediate territories, yet the Emperor's armies moved across continents with coordination and speed. Mechanicus records identified the restoration of ancient subterranean transit routes and the repurposing of aerospace craft as factors in this mobility. Supply lines, once thought impossible to maintain across devastated geographies, were re-established under Imperial oversight. Ammunition reached the front in sufficient quantities, medical supplies were available even in prolonged campaigns, and heavy armor was relocated over distances that would have been prohibitive for lesser powers. The Mechanicus paid particular attention to the culture of technological discipline evident in the Emperor's forces. Unlike other factions who viewed ancient machines as expendable relics, his armies exhibited a practice of repair, calibration, and preservation. Weapons were not discarded when damaged but restored through systematic maintenance. Vehicles were serviced regularly, armor was kept in functional condition, and ammunition production followed standard patterns. For the Mechanicus, this was evidence of a doctrine that treated technology as a system to be preserved and optimized rather than consumed recklessly. They regarded this as a precursor to the great manufacturing programs that would later define the Great Crusade. The Administratum and the Mechanicus, despite their differences in focus, converged on the conclusion that logistics was the decisive element in the unification. They both recorded instances where the balance of resources determined outcomes as surely as battlefield tactics. Campaigns were not won by brute force alone, but by the careful alignment of supply, infrastructure, and organization. In the Saturnine Basin, for example, an enemy coalition held fortified ground that had repelled multiple assaults by rival warlords. The Emperor's forces succeeded not through overwhelming attack, but by cutting supply chains, appropriating surrounding farmland, and establishing a blockade sustained by their own restored infrastructure. Where others would have depleted their strength against entrenched defences, the Imperials maintained pressure until the enemy collapsed from lack of food and materiel. For the Administratum, this was evidence of applied governance through war. For the Mechanicus, it was a demonstration of superior logistical planning and resource optimization. The archives also remark upon the integration of conquered populations into the logistical framework. Rather than exterminating or enslaving survivors indiscriminately, the Emperor absorbed them into production chains. Skilled workers were relocated to forges, labourers were organised into supply networks, and some militias were incorporated as auxiliary forces. Both the Administratum and Mechanicus saw in this policy the seed of later imperial practices, where populations were regarded as both a resource and an obligation to be accounted for. The warlords had consumed lives without concern for continuity. The Imperials managed them as assets within a larger system. Analysts within the Administratum often remarked upon the sheer scale of record-keeping implied by these operations. Though the original documents are lost, later bureaucrats reconstructed that reports must have flowed through organised chains of command, with officers accountable not merely for combat performance, but for supply metrics, personnel counts, and territory yields. In the Administratum's judgment, this was the prototype for the reporting hierarchies that later enabled governance of an entire Imperium. The precision with which resources were allocated, redirected, and expanded suggested a bureaucracy already embryonic in form, though still subordinate to the Emperor's direct command. Analysts within the Administratum often remarked upon the sheer scale of record-keeping implied by these operations. Though the original documents are lost, later bureaucrats reconstructed that reports must have flowed through organized chains of command, with officers accountable not merely for combat performance, but for supply metrics, personnel counts, and territory yields. In the Administratum's judgment, this was the prototype for the reporting hierarchies that later enabled governance of an entire imperium. The precision with which resources were allocated, redirected, and expanded suggested a bureaucracy already embryonic in form, though still subordinate to the Emperor's direct command. Mechanicus evaluations of recovered weapons and armor fragments likewise stressed consistency of manufacture. Though many artifacts are impossible to date with precision, metallurgical studies suggest that forges during the unification were operating with consistent patterns, alloys, and energy sources. The Mechanicus judged this as proof that the Emperor had either restored lost production centres or constructed new ones in secrecy. This capability, more than any single weapon, distinguished his armies from the rest. The warlords who wielded singular artifacts could overwhelm opponents in limited engagements, but none could field standardized war gear in numbers sufficient to sustain extended campaigns. The retrospective conclusions of both institutions shared a final theme, that the unification demonstrated the indivisibility of military power, governance, and technology. The Administratum argued that no conquest could last without administrative order, and the Mechanicus argued that no war could be sustained without technological stewardship. Both agreed that the Emperor's genius lay not in the novelty of his weapons nor the brutality of his battles, but in the fusion of systems that allowed all parts of his campaign to function in harmony. From this foundation, the Imperium itself would later be built, with the Administratum claiming lineage from the proto-bureaucracies of this period, and the Mechanicus seeing foreshadowings of the industrial integration that would come with the Treaty of Mars. Thus, the Unification Wars, in their analysis, were less a chronicle of battles than a demonstration of systemic order imposed upon entropy. What the warlords lacked was not courage or firepower, but the means to sustain and coordinate them. What the Emperor established was a model in which war became an instrument of governance, governance became a system of logistics, and logistics became inseparable from technology. In this way, the Administratum and the Mechanicus both judged the unification not as the end of Old Night alone, but as the proof that order could once again be engineered across the ruins of humanity. The archival reconstructions of the Unification Wars give particular emphasis to the conflicts that defined the Emperor's consolidation of Terra. Where earlier partisans had offered myths of golden-armoured warriors or supernatural storms, the Administratum and the Mechanicus recorded campaigns in terms of terrain, material, casualties, and tactical process. Their accounts, although stripped of legend, nonetheless convey the vast scale of the wars. Among the first major campaigns noted in these records were the battles against the Panpacific tribes. The Panpacific region, devastated by ancient wars and environmental collapse, had given rise to techno-barbarian warlords whose followers numbered in the millions. They were armed with a mix of crude melee weapons, salvaged firearms, and unstable energy devices dredged from buried vaults. Administratum reports reconstructed after the fact describe populations living in fortified nomadic camps, sustained by scavenging and plunder. Mechanicus evaluators later identified the Pan-Pacific arsenals as composed of volatile atomic munitions and degenerate pattern plasma devices used without regard for stability. When the Emperor's forces advanced into the region, the Pan-Pacific tribes attempted to overwhelm them through sheer weight of numbers and the use of environmental hazards. Radiation zones were deliberately employed as kill fields, and enemy leaders herded populations into sacrificial charges. One of the better preserved reports, attributed to an early officer later absorbed into the Proto-Imperial Army, describes the experience of such an encounter. He wrote that the tribes advanced in a wave, their bodies wrapped in rags and scrap armor, many already suffering from radiation lesions. Behind them, war engines built from reassembled industrial machinery spat unstable fire, igniting both foe and ally alike. The Emperor's forces, by contrast, met the onslaught with disciplined lines, controlled volleys of bolt shells and mechanized flanking maneuvers. The battle became not a contest of courage but of endurance, the tribes exhausting themselves against the disciplined firepower and mobile armor of the Imperials. Administratum casualty estimates suggest losses among the Pan-Pacific peoples in the tens of thousands within a single day of fighting, while Imperial losses were noted as minimal. Another pivotal theatre was the Indonesic bloc. This region had once been a centre of manufacturing, and its surviving warlords commanded sophisticated weapons caches, including gravitic devices and armoured suits predating the Age of Strife. The administratum was struck by the complexity of the resistance there. Unlike the Pan-Pacific tribes, the Indonesic forces did not rely solely on massed infantry, but deployed disciplined phalanxes of soldiers, supported by energy shields and mechanized walkers. Administratum records describe engagements fought street by street in surviving cities, where each block had been turned into a defensive redoubt. The Emperor's forces suffered higher losses here than in most campaigns, a fact acknowledged by later record keepers as a demonstration that not all resistance was swept aside with ease. An eyewitness testimony, preserved through Mechanicus channels, details the storming of an Indonesic fortress complex. A member of the Emperor's Thunder Warriors recounted that the defenders used gravitic repulsors to collapse entire avenues, burying Imperial armor columns beneath rubble. The assault was pressed nonetheless, with genetically enhanced warriors leading charges into shielded barricades. The testimony describes the noise of bolt guns hammering against energy fields, the air thick with pulverized stone and burning plasma discharges. The account ends abruptly, suggesting the warrior did not survive the battle, yet its preservation was deemed valuable as it illustrated the intensity of fighting that characterized the Indonesic front. Administratum summaries emphasized that the Emperor eventually overcame the bloc not by sheer force, but by attrition and encirclement. The Imperials isolated production centers, redirected rivers to flood defensive lines, and cut off food and fuel reserves. The collapse of the Indonesic resistance demonstrated, in the judgment of Imperial analysts, the inevitability of logistical dominance over technological advantage when the latter was unsustained. The Mechanicus further noted that the capture of intact Indonesic forges significantly increased the Emperor's manufacturing capacity, providing material that was incorporated into subsequent campaigns. The most infamous campaigns, however, were those against the Nordafrik conclaves. The conclaves had arisen from industrial enclaves that had turned to techno-feudalism after Old Night. Their rulers employed chemical and biological weaponry extensively, lacing water supplies with toxins and deploying clouds of engineered spores upon advancing armies. Administratum records are unusually detailed in this theatre, suggesting either that Imperial scribes placed particular emphasis on these battles or that they had access to more surviving documentation. They describe whole regiments of auxiliaries reduced to corpses within hours, their lungs liquefied by airborne pathogens. Entire settlements were rendered uninhabitable by toxic saturations, forcing the Imperials to adopt sealed armor protocols and avoid direct occupation until countermeasures could be devised. A field account attributed to a medical officer describes a scene after one such engagement. Rows of bodies were laid out on scorched earth, their skin blistered and their eyes clouded. The stench was described as unbearable, even through rebreathers. The officer remarked that the Emperor's warriors seemed unmoved by the devastation, advancing methodically into ground where no unprotected human could survive. Mechanicus analysts later recorded that the countermeasures developed in these campaigns represented the first standardized use of sealed power armor systems across broad segments of Imperial forces, setting a precedent for the life support integration that would later define Astartes' war gear. The Pan-Pacific, Indonesic and Nordafrik campaigns are frequently cited together in administratum compilations as case studies in overcoming diverse forms of resistance. They represented mass attritional warfare, fortified industrial resistance, and chemical-biological terror respectively. Each demonstrated the Emperor's armies adapting to unique threats and absorbing enemy technologies or strategies into their own systems. To the Mechanicus, these campaigns revealed the range of forgotten technologies that still lingered on Terra, from unstable plasma to gravitic weapons to gene-tailored pathogens. To the administratum, they proved that no matter the weapon employed, organised logistics and systemic governance ultimately overmatched all resistance. The Saturnine Basin campaign was another focal point in their records. Located in the remnants of what had once been a great industrial hub, the basin had become a fortress region, where warlords maintained towering citadels bristling with scavenged macro-weapons. Administratum accounts reconstructed the campaign as a methodical reduction of entrenched positions through siege and blockade. Supplies were cut, farmland was appropriated, and the imperial lines advanced incrementally until the defenders were starved into surrender. Mechanicus notes highlight the recovery of functioning macro batteries that were later integrated into imperial arsenals. Surviving testimony from civilians recounts months of hunger and bombardment, the ground shaking continuously as imperial artillery pounded defensive walls. Yet when the final surrender came, it was reported that order was swiftly restored, rationing implemented, and production restarted under imperial oversight. The records also preserve accounts of the conquest of the European enclaves, a series of hive-like cities that had descended into hereditary feudalism. Here, warfare took place within the enclosed structures of arcology towers, where firefights echoed down steel corridors and armoured breaches punched through bulkhead after bulkhead. The administratum noted the sheer difficulty of controlling such vertical environments, where defenders could collapse entire levels onto attackers or flood sections with toxins. A survivor's testimony describes Imperial forces advancing floor by floor, marking each cleared zone before sealing it and moving upward. The casualty rate was described as staggering, yet the Imperials persevered, ultimately bringing the enclaves under their control. Mechanicus evaluations noted that the reclamation of these cities provided vital manufacturing nodes that were restored to production within decades, underscoring the dual role of conquest and reconstruction. The Administratum and Mechanicus records converge in their analysis of these campaigns. Both institutions acknowledge the extraordinary diversity of threats encountered during the unification. Populations armed with primitive weapons, others wielding advanced technologies, and still others deploying terror and chemical warfare. All were encountered and overcome. In each case, the Emperor's armies adapted systematically, employing superior logistics, technology, and discipline. Administratum analysts emphasize the bureaucratic processes of integration and resource allocation. Mechanicus observers stressed the recovery and repurposing of technological relics. Together, their records present the unification not merely as a sequence of battles, but as a cumulative process of absorbing and neutralizing every form of resistance Terra could produce. Perhaps most striking in these compilations are the eyewitness testimonies that survive, preserved not for their emotion but for their data value. Officers, medics, and even civilians contributed descriptions of the wars that later analysts treated as reference material. Their accounts of firestorms, collapsing cities, poisoned air, and endless columns of armoured warriors provide a human dimension to otherwise clinical records. Yet even these were preserved in service of analysis, used to gauge morale, resilience, and the psychological effects of total war. The Administratum considered such data essential to predicting future compliance of conquered populations, while the Mechanicus regarded them as case studies in human endurance under technological assault. From the viewpoint of both institutions, these notable campaigns proved a central conclusion: that the Unification Wars were not decided by singular battles of mythic scale, but by the consistent application of systemic order across diverse and hostile environments. Every resistance, no matter how entrenched or terrifying, was overcome by the same triad of governance, discipline, and technology. It was this lesson, recorded and transmitted through Administratum reports and Mechanicus treatises, that later shaped the very doctrines of the Imperium. In the aftermath of the campaigns that defined the unification, the records preserved by both the Administratum and the Mechanicus become increasingly concerned with the consequences rather than the clashes themselves. The battles had been studied as events of destruction, but what most impressed later archivists was the process of reconstruction, the manner in which ruined populations were reorganized, and the long-term effects that these wars had on Terra's social and technological landscape. A recurring theme in the testimonies that survive from participants is the dissonance between devastation and immediate order. One auxiliary soldier, writing from the Nordafrik front, described how villages had been burned to ash, the ground littered with bodies swollen from toxins, and yet within weeks imperial banners had been erected, ration stores had been established, and survivors were already being conscripted into labour details. He remarked that the war seemed to erase the past in days, replacing chaos with something that appeared inevitable. To him, the speed of transformation was more striking than the battles themselves. A Mechanicus record contains the words of a local technician conscripted after the fall of the Indonesic bloc. He recounted how workshops that had once forged war engines for the bloc's armies were seized intact. Within days, imperial overseers had reclassified production quotas, technicians were reassigned to repair existing machines, and the same forges that had once resisted the emperor were now supplying his forces. The witness noted that he was given no choice but to comply, yet he also admitted that the imperial organization was efficient to a degree he had never experienced under the bloc's feudal lords. Food was distributed in measured rations, equipment was logged and accounted for, and though conditions were harsh, survival was assured where previously it had not been. Administratum analysis emphasized that these rapid transformations were not spontaneous, but the result of deliberate policy. Territories were not left to collapse after conquest. Civil administrators moved in alongside military forces, introducing systems of rationing, census, and work allocation. Records suggest that even in regions where destruction had been total, survivors were sorted into categories of usefulness: skilled labourers assigned to workshops, the strong-bodied directed into construction or agricultural recovery, and the infirm or resistant quietly eliminated or abandoned. To the administratum, this demonstrated the emperor's insistence that every conquest must yield tangible resources, whether manpower, industry, or land. Mechanicus reports focused on the reconstitution of technology. They recorded how plasma reactors, macro weapons, and armoured vehicles were salvaged, stripped, or repurposed. Even weapons once designed for resistance were incorporated into the imperial arsenal. A Mechanicus commentary noted that the emperor's forces showed no hesitation in utilizing enemy technology, provided it could be standardized or controlled. Unlike other warlords who feared or venerated relics, the Imperials viewed machines purely as tools to be mastered. The aftermath of each battle was therefore as important as the engagement itself, for it was in the salvage yards, workshops, and reconstruction sites that the true consolidation occurred. Eyewitness reports often convey the human cost of these processes in ways that statistics cannot. A civilian account from the European enclaves describes how survivors emerged from collapsed towers to find themselves herded into holding camps. The witness recalled the sound of Vox announcements dictating work schedules, the stamping of identity records, and the sorting of families. She wrote of a sense of numbness, of watching her home reduced to rubble, yet being absorbed almost seamlessly into a new system where her previous allegiances no longer mattered. Administratum archivists later cited this testimony as evidence of the psychological power of immediate bureaucratic imposition, where survivors were overwhelmed not only by military defeat, but by the sudden replacement of all structures with imperial authority. Other accounts emphasize the brutality beneath the order. One former auxiliary wrote bitterly of how entire populations were marched into work camps under armed guard. He described scenes of starvation, backbreaking labour, and summary executions for disobedience. His testimony suggested that order was achieved through relentless coercion, and that the so-called integration was often indistinguishable from enslavement. Administratum scribes did not deny this but categorized it as necessary discipline, noting that resistance could not be tolerated if unity was to be achieved. To the Mechanicus, such testimony was of less interest, but they acknowledged that labour was the primary resource by which captured industries were restored. In their final assessments, the Administratum and the Mechanicus framed the Unification Wars as a case study in systemic dominance. For the Administratum, the wars were proof that order could be imposed on a scale once thought lost forever. Every conquered territory became a ledger entry, every survivor a data point in the census, every resource a column in a calculation. The administratum's language reduced chaos to accounting, with the emperor's campaigns judged not in terms of heroism but efficiency. From their perspective, the wars were less about destruction than about absorption, the conversion of millions of disparate humans into a single managed population. The Mechanicus, on the other hand, regarded the unification as a triumph of technological reclamation. To them, the most important result of each battle was not the death of enemies, but the recovery of machines, forges, and technical expertise. They catalogued how gravitic weapons, plasma devices, macro batteries, and gene labs were captured and repurposed. In their archives, the wars appear as a process of technological reintegration, a piecemeal recovery of fragments from the dark age of technology, all harnessed under the discipline of the Emperor's oversight. They noted with approval the standardized maintenance procedures, the uniformity of war gear, and the systemic exploitation of salvage. Together, their perspectives converge on a broader conclusion. The Unification Wars were not simply military conquests, they were the practical demonstration of how humanity could be reorganized after millennia of fragmentation. Battles that eyewitnesses remembered as chaos and terror were, in bureaucratic and technical records, reduced to numbers and schematics. Populations became labor units, cities became production nodes, weapons became assets to be catalogued. The Administratum and the Mechanicus judged the success of the Emperor not in mythic terms but in measurable outcomes: tonnage of resources secured, percentages of population absorbed, number of forges brought online. In the closing summaries preserved by both institutions, a single observation stands out. They concluded that the wars were not won on the battlefield alone, but in the aftermath, where every ruin was reorganized, every survivor accounted for, and every fragment of technology claimed. It was in these processes that Terra was truly unified, not merely by conquest, but by the systematic imposition of order. From this perspective, the Unification Wars were less an end to chaos than the first great rehearsal for the Imperium itself. Under the scrutiny of the Inquisition, the era of the Unification Wars is viewed through a lens different from that of the Administratum or the Mechanicum. Where those institutions saw order imposed upon disorder, or a grand engineering of empire and dominion, the Inquisition has always sought out the fractures, the anomalies, and the concealed truths hidden beneath the triumphalist accounts. The consolidation of old Earth is presented in sanctioned records as an inevitable step toward humanity's survival. Yet inquisitorial reviews, when permitted, reveal threads of uncertainty and findings that defy straightforward explanation. Within ancient data vaults there exist fragmented reports describing phenomena that have never been reconciled with the official history, accounts that suggest events not entirely attributable to the actions of warlords or their technology alone. These elements have led inquisitors to describe the Unification period as one of profound discontinuity, a span where humanity advanced under the hand of a singular figure, but also one where shadows of unexplained origin intermingled with human ambition. The most frequently cited matter in inquisitorial circles is the sheer abruptness with which the warlord later known as the Emperor rose above his rivals. Contemporary witnesses recorded in surviving journals described his armies as not merely better armed but as operating with uncanny precision. This has led some inquisitors to question whether all victories of the Unification can be accounted for by superior strategy or force of arms. There are reports, long suppressed, of entire opposing factions surrendering without battle, as if overcome by an influence no commander could rationally explain. Such testimony often comes from oral traditions carried in the remnant populations of subjugated territories, preserved quietly despite centuries of official silence. When these fragments are compiled, they suggest that the consolidation of Terra was shaped not solely by conventional conquest, but by the presence of forces that worked upon the minds and wills of men in ways still unmeasured. Further unexplainable findings involve the war machines employed during the wars. The towering armoured constructs deployed by the Emperor's armies were catalogued later by the Mechanicum with some precision, yet the earliest battlefield observations often describe machines of such size and efficiency that even present analysis cannot account for their origin. In some reports they are described as ancient rediscovered relics rather than newly forged constructs, their power sources operating beyond the capacity of the technology of that age. The Inquisition notes that while later imperial records describe a deliberate rediscovery of technology from the Dark Age, many of these accounts are vague or contradictory. It remains an open question whether all engines of war used in the Unification Wars were truly of human manufacture, or whether some were the result of contact with sources that have since been erased from the record. The Inquisition also places attention upon the scale of population control achieved within only a few generations. The transition from a fractured globe of techno-barbarian states to a unified Imperium required not only military conquest, but also the suppression of cultural memory. Yet inquisitorial review of surviving tribal lore suggests that entire traditions, languages, and even knowledge systems were systematically removed. This has raised suspicion that the process of unification involved not merely destruction by war, but active manipulation of memory, either through deliberate state programs or through means not yet understood. Some reports describe groups of individuals who seem to forget their past allegiances within days of subjugation, a phenomenon that cannot be explained by coercion alone. Whether this was the effect of unknown psychic intervention or some other practice is still debated within sealed inquisitorial chambers. Perhaps most troubling are the occasional mentions of presences encountered during battle, which were neither human nor machine. Certain records held under high classification include testimonies from surviving soldiers who spoke of moments where the air itself thickened, or where opponents fell dead without contact. These incidents are usually catalogued as unreliable, the ravings of traumatized warriors in brutal conditions. Yet the consistency of the language across separate testimonies suggests some common basis. Some inquisitors argue that these incidents may represent early, undocumented manifestations of warp interaction directed by unknown hands. Others hold that they are the marks of weapons or technologies no longer extant. In either case, the official narrative of the Unification omits these anomalies entirely, preferring to frame all victory as a function of superior leadership and military science. What emerges from the inquisitorial analysis is a duality. On one hand, the consolidation of Terra is undeniable. The fractured remnants of humanity were bound into a singular order. On the other hand, the records suggest that the methods and forces used were not fully understood even by those who fought alongside them. The Inquisition continues to regard the Unification period as a foundation not only for the Imperium, but also for the mysteries that have followed it. Mysteries that may never be resolved, yet which continue to shape the questions asked by those tasked with guarding humanity from truths it may not be prepared to face. Within the deep vaults of inquisitorial record-keeping, the Unification Wars are rarely examined for their military progression alone. The sanctioned histories compiled by the administratum emphasize the march of order, the efficiency of the Emperor's armies, and the inevitability of Terra's consolidation. The Mechanicum maintains its fascination with the technological rediscoveries attributed to this era, presenting it as the reclamation of human mastery over lost sciences. Yet the Inquisition, charged with uncovering that which others are forbidden to speak of, preserves accounts that reveal a darker, less consistent picture. Within these sealed reports lie anomalies that do not fit comfortably into the official narrative. They are whispered of as distortions in the chronology of conquest, moments where the line between truth and fabrication blurs. One such anomaly concerns the sudden disappearance of entire military hosts during campaigns against the Panpacific tribes. Administratum records describe these engagements as straightforward conquests, in which the Emperor's forces secured victory through overwhelming might. Yet sealed testimonies from surviving civilians report something far stranger. Entire cohorts vanishing overnight, their camps left intact but empty, with no signs of combat. Inquisitorial review of these accounts has noted that the loss of forces was quietly omitted from later records, suggesting a deliberate effort to conceal the occurrence. the lack of bodies, weapons, or even bloodstains defies conventional explanation. Some inquisitors speculate that these disappearances may be connected to early, undocumented psychic experimentation or contact with entities beyond the material. Others believe that rival warlords employed technology since lost, capable of displacement or annihilation at a scale not yet understood. Another troubling anomaly appears in accounts of the war against the Nordafrik conclaves. Official histories record these battles as costly but decisive, with the Emperor's armies eventually overwhelming the technologically advanced city-states. Yet within sealed Mechanicum archives there exist references to weapons encountered during this campaign that behaved in ways inconsistent with any known design. Fragments of data describe projectiles that dissolved armoured plating without heat, sound, or chemical trace, and energy emissions that registered outside the measurable spectrum. Inquisitorial scientists reviewing these fragments centuries later have concluded that either the Nordafrik conclaves had access to technologies from the dark age of technology far beyond what was admitted, or that the descriptions were deliberately altered to conceal their true origin. What remains unexplained is why, after the conquest, so few examples of such weaponry were ever recovered. The discrepancy between reported battlefield use and the absence of surviving artifacts continues to trouble investigators. In the wars against the Scandic tribes, another sealed report describes atmospheric phenomena that accompanied major engagements. Soldiers reported skies filled with shifting colours and distortions of distance, where enemies appeared both near and impossibly far in the same instant. These distortions often preceded sudden breakdowns in discipline among the enemy, with warriors either fleeing or turning upon one another in confusion. Administratum accounts frame these incidents as clever psychological warfare or the effects of advanced signal disruption. Yet the Inquisition has cross-referenced the testimonies with later accounts of warp disturbances, finding unsettling parallels. If true, this would suggest that warp interference, or even manipulation, may have played a role in the wars long before the Imperium publicly admitted to its reliance on psychers. The secrecy surrounding this possibility implies an intentional effort to preserve the illusion that victory was achieved purely by material force. Perhaps the most deeply buried anomaly relates to the so-called Ghost Division. Within a handful of classified Mechanicum logs exists mention of a formation of warriors that appeared at key battles without prior record, fought with impossible efficiency, and vanished without integrating into the larger army. These warriors were described as clad in plain armour lacking heraldry, yet wielded weapons that left no identifiable residue. Their presence was said to turn the tide of otherwise uncertain engagements, particularly in the early stages of the Western Hemisphere campaigns. Official records make no mention of them, and in some cases entire engagements where their presence was noted were removed from the accepted chronology. The Inquisition has theorized that this division may have represented early prototypes of transhuman soldiers, later developed into the Legiones Astartes, or perhaps something more singular and secret. The complete absence of physical remains or artifacts tied to their existence makes verification impossible, yet the repetition of their description across disparate reports suggests an origin not entirely fabricated. The aftermath of such anomalies is equally telling. Entire strata of data were sealed under orders from the highest levels, their access restricted not to the Administratum or the Mechanicum, but to inquisitorial oversight alone. The rationale for such classification has often been stated as the protection of humanity's morale, preserving the image of a seamless rise to unity under the Emperor's hand. Yet inquisitors reviewing these files argue that their concealment points toward truths that might destabilize the accepted foundation of the Imperium. To acknowledge unexplained disappearances, technologies unaccounted for, or forces that defy material analysis would raise questions about the actual methods of unification, and about what bargains or discoveries were made in that turbulent time. It is within these sealed reports that the true nature of the Unification Wars becomes difficult to define. While the Imperium teaches that Terra was brought to heel through the clarity of reason, the precision of military power, and the inevitability of the Emperor's vision, inquisitorial evidence reveals cracks in this certainty. There are unexplained voids, contradictions, and suppressed accounts that suggest something more complex than conquest alone. The wars were not merely the story of a single figure rising above techno-barbarism. They were also a theatre where phenomena still unclassified emerged and disappeared. For the Inquisition, the lesson is that the roots of the Imperium lie not only in triumph, but also in shadows that remain unspoken in the halls of power, but never forgotten in the archives where forbidden truths are kept. The files that remain under inquisitorial seal concerning the Unification Wars are seldom spoken of even within the highest conclaves. They exist in fragmentary collections, their entries often redacted, their context deliberately obscured. What survives paints a picture far less coherent than the officially sanctioned histories. These documents were never intended for dissemination, and their secrecy lies not in irrelevance, but in the disruptive nature of what they suggest. Where the Administratum's records present a seamless march toward unification, these classified files reveal gaps, contradictions, and traces of knowledge that hint at a reality more complex and at times more troubling than what humanity has been permitted to remember. One such file concerns the so-called Ashen Cities of Central Asia. The sanctioned version describes them as pre-imperial urban remnants, reduced to ruin during the campaigns of unification. Yet the sealed account indicates that these ruins existed long before the warlords reached them, their populations extinguished in a single night without any sign of battle. Inquisitorial investigators who later surveyed the remains reported no chemical, biological, or nuclear signatures, only structures rendered brittle and lifeless, as though subjected to energies that had leached vitality itself from the stone. The event is noted without conclusion, only the remark that the Emperor himself walked among the ruins and gave no explanation. The absence of clarity and the abrupt ending of the file only deepens suspicion that something other than war brought about this annihilation. Another heavily classified set of documents revolves around the final pacification of Panpacific strongholds. Official records emphasize decisive battles and the capture of leaders, yet the inquisitorial archive contains references to negotiations undertaken in secret chambers beneath the ocean fortresses. The surviving minutes suggest that emissaries of the Pan-Pacific states spoke not of surrender, but of compacts with powers they described as older than humanity. The notes are vague, the wording inconsistent, and much of the file has been struck through with imperial seals. Yet the implications remain that the war was resolved not by conquest alone, but through the silencing of forces whose allegiance lay beyond the material realm. Perhaps most disturbing are the classified medical reports from the early Legiones Astartes prototypes. Publicly, these warriors are presented as the pinnacle of transhuman engineering, perfected in the years following unification. The restricted files, however, speak of entire cohorts rendered unstable, their physical forms degrading in unnatural ways, or their minds overwhelmed by voices no gene conditioning could silence. Some reports conclude that these prototypes were deployed nonetheless, their destruction explained away as battlefield attrition. This has led Inquisitors to suspect that the clean narrative of the Legion's origins conceals a series of catastrophic failures, some of which may have unleashed phenomena untraceable by science alone. What emerges from these classified fragments is not a simple tale of triumph, but a landscape of suppression. Events are recorded without explanation, anomalies are noted only to be sealed, and victories are framed in language designed to obscure as much as to reveal. From the inquisitorial perspective, the true legacy of the Unification Wars is not only the consolidation of Terra, but the deliberate construction of a myth. The Emperor's rise is portrayed as inevitable, yet the shadows within these files suggest that inevitability was reinforced through omission, manipulation, and the burial of truths too dangerous to acknowledge. The final thoughts preserved in inquisitorial commentary reflect both reverence and unease, reverence for the monumental achievement of binding humanity into a single polity after millennia of decay, but unease at the cost of clarity. To guard humanity is not only to protect it from external enemies, but also from knowledge that might unravel the fragile unity upon which survival depends. Thus, the Unification Wars stand in inquisitorial archives not as a pure origin, but as a point of fracture, where truth and myth were woven together so tightly that they cannot now be separated. The lesson for the Inquisition is that vigilance must remain constant, for the same currents that moved unseen in that age may still stir, hidden beneath the surface of imperial history, waiting to reappear when least expected.